are listening to Black Pine Archives. Out here, beyond the last porch light and the last reliable bar of signal, people still see things that do not fit field guides or training manuals. Tonight, we opened 9 case files where something in the dark tried to copy voices, borrow shapes, and test the edge between animal and human. If any of these accounts matches something you have seen, stay until the end and add your own report to the archive. For now, keep your lights low, your volume steady, and let us begin. Story 1. He repeated my partner's voice on our secure channel. Officer Daniel Keene had been on nights long enough to know the county by sound as much as by sight. The high ridges threw radio traffic in odd directions. The low valleys filled with fog that ate headlights, and the old timber cuts hid more meth shacks than cabins now. It was the kind of place where you learned to trust your training, your partner, and the encrypted radio channel that tied cruisers to dispatch. His partner that rotation was Officer Harris, riding a separate unit on the far side of the main ridge. They worked a staggered pattern, overlapping just enough that each could respond to the other within roughly 15 minutes, assuming normal conditions. Their radios ran on a digital trunked system with voice identification software layered over it, a system that stamped each transmission with a numerical confidence score tied to a known officer. It was a slow night in late autumn. One noise complaint from a trailer park, one welfare checkout near the highway. Nothing that raised pulse or voice. The sky had clouded in, holding the sodium orange glow of town low over the hills. Around what his dash clock insisted was just after midnight, Daniel rolled into a stretch of county route that locals called the Sink. The Sink was a shallow bowl of trees between 2 ridges where fog settled early and signal bars went to 0, in a way the radio technicians blamed on topography. Engines sounded different there, more muffled, as if the air itself were thicker. He was halfway through that section when his radio opened with a sharp burst of static and then a voice that snapped fully through his fatigue. It was Harris. The cadence was right, clipped but calm. The slight scrape in the throat that meant his partner needed water, the habit of leading with his unit number before anything else. It was exactly the sound Daniel knew as well as his own. The content was wrong. The voice called out a 10 code and requested immediate assistance at a location Harris was not supposed to be anywhere near, describing a low valley off an old logging spur that both men knew only as a rumor, a place dispatch maps showed as unassigned green. No houses, no towers, no businesses, no reason for a marked unit to be there. The transmission sounded like Harris, but he was talking from somewhere I knew he could not be. From Officer Keene's written statement, Daniel thumbed his mic and answered on instinct, asking for clarification. Before he finished, dispatch cut in, their tone tight in a way he did not hear often. According to their console, Officer Harris's unit was idling at a fuel station miles to the west, just off the interstate. His automatic vehicle locator pinged clean and strong. A moment after dispatch spoke, the real Harris came across the same channel in his usual dry way, asking what distress call Daniel thought he had heard and saying he was fine. For a few seconds, the channel carried both identities at once. The normal Harris relaxed under fluorescent lights, and a second copy breathing hard and insisting that he was pinned down near a quarry pond with no line of retreat. When the audio was pulled later and run through the analysis software, the system produced a confidence number that bothered everyone who saw it. Voice ID matched to Officer H, calculated at approximately 87%, with anomalous deviations in stress markers and formant structure. From the audio analysis summary in the car, before any of that lab language existed, Daniel felt something colder than simple fear. the sense that the tools he trusted to sort real from unreal were suddenly blurred. He requested a repeat of the location. The Valley Voice supplied it without hesitation. The name of an old quarry, the designation of a spur road that had not been maintained in years, a rough distance marker from the last paved intersection. It added details about a suspect, about cover positions, about lines of fire. It spoke like an officer under pressure doing everything right. Dispatch checked their mapping overlay. The coordinates lined up with a blank patch of county, contour lines folding close together, cell provider coverage maps, admitting there was nothing there to bounce off. Signal source triangulated from repeater logs to low elevation area between south and west towers. No documented tower coverage for that depression. From the dispatcher log, the radio technician on duty advised caution over the air, voice a shade too neutral. The night sergeant ordered Daniel to hold at the mouth of the spur and wait for a second unit before descending. Daniel acknowledged, but his right hand had already turned the wheel. Training fought with the more primitive part of his brain that did not like the idea of any version of his partner calling for help unanswered. He compromised. He pulled off onto the gravel of the spur, only far enough that his laptop's data connection flickered once and then failed outright. The trees rose taller here, branches locking overhead like fingers. His headlights showed only wet trunks, bare undergrowth, and a single faint set of older tire ruts leading downward. The rest of the world shrank to the cut of his beams and the black beyond. Then the radio went quiet. Not noisy, quiet. The low carrier hiss that sat under every call, the background comfort of a living system, disappeared in an instant. The speaker became a dead black square. He stopped the cruiser, pulse loud in his ears. Training drew a clear line in his mind that he realized he had already crossed. He was in a known dead zone with unverified information, chasing something that did not fit basic checks. He put the car in reverse and backed out slowly, tires hissing in the slurry, eyes flicking between mirrors and trees. At the top of the spur, as gravel met the firmer surface of the county road, his radio crackled back to life in a stuttering rush, catching the tail of dispatch calling his unit number and the other responding car confirming arrival in the area. He met that second unit under the weak glow of a single streetlight. Together, Keene and Officer Mendez left their cruisers nose out and walked down the spur on foot, staying in sight of the intersection as long as possible. Their handheld radios, set to the same encrypted channel, worked in bursts. A clear line, then a muted patch, then a hollow ringing interference that set Daniel's teeth on edge. For about 10 seconds at a time, the handhelds would go completely dead and then return as if nothing had happened. From Officer Mendez's supplemental report, they never reached the quarry pond. The drop-off in communications defined an invisible boundary. They marked the last stable spot with a strip of high-visibility tape and pushed a little farther, but each additional step cut their link to the rest of the county a little more, until they were standing in a pocket where even the comfort of static disappeared. They stopped when the hair on Daniel's arms rose under his uniform without any obvious cause. The air felt wrong there, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang like old blood on iron. The physical edge of the call lay just beyond, on a patch of flattening ground partway down the slope. The grass and leaf litter bore a set of wet, barefoot prints. The impressions were narrow, longer than Daniel's own bare foot would have been, toes aligned straight forward. They were spaced with eerie regularity, each step almost identical in distance, as if placed by measurement rather than natural gait. There were no leading tracks guiding in, no scuffed leaves or broken twigs showing an approach. The first clear print appeared out of undisturbed leaf litter, walked in a straight line for several steps, and then stopped at a point where the ground began to slope more steeply. Beside a spruce at chest height to an average person, The bark carried 4 long parallel scratches running horizontally around the trunk, not vertically up or down. The grooves were clean and relatively fresh, bark edges still moist where it had been removed, bare footprints and linear tree scoring documented at site. No associated approach or departure tracks located. From the field evidence sheet, the distance between the topmost scratch and the ground suggested that whatever had dragged its hand or limb across the tree had done so with arms longer than standard human proportion, or from a position of partial elevation. The 2 officers took photographs, bagged soil from one of the prints, and retreated to where their radios functioned more reliably. Search and rescue teams, briefed on the strange origin of the call, but tasked with treating it like any other potentially downed officer situation, swept the valley by daylight. They found the old quarry pond, a stagnant oval of green water ringed by slippery rock. They found collapsed fire rings, beer cans, and the remnants of old party trash. They found no uniform fabric, no weapon, no blood, no sign that a cruiser had ever been driven that far down. The dogs they brought worked the area reluctantly, circling wide around the section of slope where the prints had been. Handlers noted that the animals showed interest in one particular band of disturbed air, then broke off as if unwilling to pursue. Canine units indicated once at mid-slope, then refused to track further. No tangible scent source identified. From the search team, after-action summary. Back in town, the communications unit pulled the full radio log from the relevant window. The distress voice had originated from a repeater overlap zone that should not have passed traffic from that low. Triangulation pointed to the same basin where Daniel and Mendez had stood. The real Harris's unit location history never deviated from the fuel station and surrounding streets. The lab that handled audio analysis for the department wrote their conclusion carefully, balancing the need for clarity with the avoidance of outright speculation. Combined features of subject transmission indicate high similarity to enrolled Speaker Officer H, with deviations not attributable solely to stress or equipment artifact. Mimicry of known voice cannot be ruled out. From the audio analysis summary, the radio technicians tore down the repeater equipment that served the area, looking for bad boards, water intrusion, faulty grounding. They found nothing out of specification. The system checks passed. Daniel added one more line to his own internal rulebook after that night. When he drove into known dead zones, he lowered the volume on his radio a fraction, not out of disregard, but to force himself to process the content of any call against more than muscle memory response. If a voice he loved came out of the speaker from a place his maps and his instincts both marked as wrong, he defaulted to procedure instead of emotion. He never fully answered the question that sat under the surface of his own report. If he had driven that spur all the way down on the first call, alone with the radio still alive in his ear and a familiar voice urging him on, what would he have found at the bottom besides a green pond in his own empty cruiser? Archival transition. A voice used the uniform as a mask and tried to pull him into a blank on the map. The next report came from a camera that caught a body standing wrong under the trees, wearing antlers and hands in the same frame. Lena McRae set trail cameras the way other people set alarms. It was her work and her routine. She was a wildlife biologist under contract to monitor deer density on a private mix of timber and pasture, land owned by a timber company that liked hard numbers more than stories. Her days were grids and transects, pellet counts and browse lines. Her nights were memory cards and data sheets. Her equipment was standard issue: infrared trail cameras with passive motion sensors, strap mounts, time and date stamps, low glow diodes that did not spook game. She knew exactly how many amps they drew, how long batteries lasted in freezing conditions, and what a false trigger looked like when wind pushed a branch into the detection cone. She also knew the catalog of shapes that passed in front of a lens after dark. She could identify raccoon by a ringed tail blur, coyote by height and attitude, bear by the sway of shoulders. Poachers showed up as grainy human outlines in hoodies and ball caps. In some sets, if a camera was placed too close to a footpath, it would catch an occasional human hand reaching to adjust or inspect it. She did not expect the reverse. Antlers on top of a frame and something very much like a hand where a muzzle should have pressed. The camera that produced the problem sat on the edge of a narrow game lane that led from thick timber into a small clearing where she had placed a gravity feeder. It had been a reliable unit for 2 seasons. The steel feeder legs showed rub marks from bucks. The ground beneath was crosshatched with hoof prints in soft soil. It was one of her best data points. In late autumn, the unit began to behave wrong. The camera's status light still showed normal operation. The battery indicator remained strong. But when Lena hiked in to swap cards and checked the onboard counter, it logged an unusually high number of triggers for such a short deployment window. She did not think much of it until she opened the card that night at her kitchen table. The software she used displayed files in sequence. She hit play and watched the usual fast progression. Empty frames, deer nose, deer flank, raccoon tail, nothing again. Then she noticed the scroll bar. The week's worth of monitoring had produced more than 200 clips from that single unit alone. Most showed nothing but the feeder and a slice of snow-lit undergrowth. No animal, no bird, no wind-moved branch obvious enough to justify activation. Infrared sensor registered more than 200 trigger events during one deployment period. Subject visible in only 3 captures. From the trail camera system log summary, Lena slowed down and scrolled until the file names with slightly different timestamps caught her eye. Only 3 clips held anything that the software tagged as subject present. In the first clip, taken in the early hours before dawn, the feeder stood center frame. Beyond it, just at the edge of the infrared wash, a shape rose from the darker tree line. Antlers, wide and branching, caught faint light. Below the rack, a ridge of what looked like furred back and shoulder, massed in a way that suggested a large mature buck, standing head-on to the camera. The posture was wrong. The torso seemed too high above the ground. The angle of the spine, straight and vertical rather than sloped toward the forelimbs, looked more like a person standing behind a rack than an animal on 4 legs. Lena told herself it could be perspective, snow depth, shadows. She advanced to the second clip. The same silhouette stood closer now within the main pool of infrared. The antlers were clearer, tines branching in a pattern that, if she had seen them anywhere else, she might have sketched into her notebook as part of a normal scoring record. The neck beneath them was too short. The upper body looked barrel-wide, with shoulders set in line, like a human standing square to the lens. Most of the face region blew out as hard white from reflective eye shine. The camera struggled with contrast, turning whatever eyes it saw into blank ovals. There was no visible muzzle, no protruding nose. What stopped Lena's breath was what occupied the lower right of the frame. One forelimb was raised, reaching toward the camera. Where there should have been a cleft hoof, the limb ended in an array of long digits splayed against empty air, each segment clearly jointed, each fingertip pressing a separate shadow, hand-like appendage observed extending toward lens. No evidence of muzzle or hoof contact with camera housing. From the technician's review report, Lena froze the frame, zoomed, enhanced as much as the cheap software would allow. The skin on the appendage looked pale in infrared, not covered in the heavier hair one would expect on an animal leg. She could make out suggestions of knuckles, a tension line along what would have been a palm. The third clip lasted less than a second. The camera triggered, recorded a jitter of motion, then caught a close image of something pressed almost against the glass. An expanse of textured skin, ridged with faint creases, cold enough that a halo of condensation fogged around the edge of contact. The shape of the contact suggested a palm pad, not quite human in proportion. The base was broadened, the fingers longer and set at slightly oblique angles, like a hand modeled from memory by someone who had never seen one up close. Lena sat back from the screen and let the room's sound settle around her. Her refrigerator hummed. A baseboard heater ticked. Outside, the wind pushed at the clapboard. She replayed the 3 clips, then pulled still frames out and printed them. The dates and times stamped on the files placed them within one short window on a single night. Between those events, the infrared sensor had continued to fire on what looked like empty scenes. She logged the anomaly in her field notebook and scheduled a site visit for the next day. When Lena and a colleague hiked in, the overnight temperature had stayed low enough for the snowpack to hold impressions cleanly. They expected, given the volume of feed use, to see overlapping hoof marks packed around the feeder legs and random game trails weaving in and out of the clearing. Instead, the snow around the feeder and camera showed a pattern that did not fit any of the field guides. On the approach lane, normal deer sign appeared for several yards. Paired heart-shaped prints staggered at a diagonal depth consistent with an adult animal. Then the trackway changed. The 2-hoof pattern broke off abruptly and was replaced by impressions roughly the size and shape of human hands. Each of those prints showed a broad palm area with long finger marks extending forward. The digits sank deep as if most of the weight rested on them. The arrangement was quadrupedal. 2 hand-like prints on one side of an invisible center line, 2 on the other, alternating in a way that suggested a 4-limbed gait. The stride was too long for a person moving on all 4s, too narrow for a deer walking normally. Trackway morphology suggests manual-type impressions used for primary weight-bearing in quadrupedal pattern. From Lena's field notes, the line of those prints circled the feeder once, cutting clean arcs in the snow, then approached the camera tree to within arm's length. At that point, the impressions grew deeper, as if the subject had paused and leaned in. A few inches from the camera mount, the prints overlap into a single muddle of pressure, consistent with someone or something placing its upper body close to the trunk. Beyond that point, the trackway led back into the timber and broke up where the snow thinned under heavy canopy. It did not return to a hoofed pattern. It simply faded where ground cover took over. Lena photographed every step, every angle. She took plaster casts of 2 of the clearest impressions near the feeder. The casts, once set, showed ridge-like textures in the palm region that looked disturbingly like skin patterns, although the resolution was not high enough to call them prints in a forensic sense. She brought the images and the video files to the property manager and then to a state wildlife officer. Both men viewed the clips in stiff silence, then fell back on the safest explanation they had. Possible trespasser in costume, possible camera glitch, possible layered frames from a unit left too long in the field. Lena had been the one to service the camera weekly. She knew how often she cleared debris and checked alignment. She knew no one else had access to the card. The timber company sent the files to an independent technician for additional review. The written statement came back in careful language that tried not to step beyond evidence. Infrared recordings from Unit 9 show a tall subject with antler-like projections and apparent bipedal posture. In frame 71, an appendage consistent with an enlarged hand contacts the airspace near the lens. No conventional cervid behavior or morphology explains the combination observed. No overt signs of digital tampering detected. From the contracted technician's memo at Lena's request, A veterinary pathologist with experience in ungulate anatomy examined prints and stills. The pathologist noted that the limb jointing and load distribution did not match deer, elk, or moose, nor did they resemble known quadrupedal predators. Human involvement could not be ruled out, but the gait parameters made sustained movement in that posture unlikely without mechanical assistance. Lena replaced the camera with a new unit rated for faster shutter speed and higher resolution. She moved the feeder 20 yards, thinking perhaps that the placement itself had made the site idiosyncratic. For the rest of that season, the new camera captured nothing unusual. Deer fed at dawn and dusk. Raccoons climbed the feeder legs. Once, a bear cub investigated the camera and fogged the lens with a very normal muzzle. The odd trigger spike never recurred. The file counts stayed within expected ranges. The infrared did not fire hundreds of times on seemingly empty air. Lena archived the 3 strange clips and the associated notes in a separate folder on her laptop. She printed 3 still images and pinned them above her desk in sequence. The distant antlered outline with a body held too upright. The nearer frame with a hand-like limb reaching toward the lens. The close smeared imprint that showed texture but refused detail. She told colleagues the case was an interesting camera anomaly, useful for teaching students about misinterpretation. In her personal notebook, she wrote something different. Subject demonstrated precise control of triggering distance and framing. Appears to understand sensor cone and deliberately approached, observed, and tested device. Behavior suggests curiosity about camera, not feeder. She did not show that line to the timber company. What stayed with her more than the images was the pattern in the data. An entity that could move through a monitored corridor, set off a sensor hundreds of times, and choose to be visible in only 3 of those activations, leaving just enough evidence to exist without permitting a full look. Archival transition, antlers and fingers occupied the same frame for less than a second of footage. The next account followed a line of tracks that climbed a sheer rock face and stopped at a height no animal should have reached. Raymond Coates had hunted those foothills long enough that he could read the ground like a page. He knew which draws held cold air late into the morning, where deer crossed when the wind came down from the ridge, and how fresh snow would hide older sign under a clean skin. He had also learned over years of seasons what tracks were worth following and what tracks were meant to waste time. On a late season morning in early winter, Raymond and his brother Nolan cut off a logging road to skirt a small basin and reach a stand of fir before first light burned off the fog. The snow that day was wet and heavy, the kind that clung to boot soles and made every step loud. The air smelled like wood smoke from distant chimneys and sap from broken limbs weighed down by ice. They found the trackway where the road dipped, and the mud beneath the snow showed through in dark seams. At first, Raymond thought it was bear sign. The region had black bears, and late season sometimes pushed them into odd routes, but the first impression stopped that assumption. The print was too long, the pad was too wide, the toe shapes were blunt and spaced in a way that did not match a bear's splayed front foot. The claw marks, faint but present, were too short for a cat and too clean for a bear that had slid in wet snow. Raymond measured it the only way he trusted in the field. He laid his forearm down beside it, wrist to elbow, and the print nearly matched the length. The stride between impressions suggested a heavy animal that moved without dragging. No belly fur lines, no tail sweep, no stumble marks. They followed because that is what hunters do when they see something that does not fit. Curiosity is a kind of instinct, and it can be as strong as hunger. The prints angled uphill through a stand of young fir, each step pressed deep enough to expose soil under the snow. The trackway did not wander the way a searching animal might. It moved with a steady, deliberate line, as if the subject knew exactly where it wanted to go. Raymond noted what was missing as much as what was present. There were no scat piles, no obvious feeding sign, no broken branches at shoulder height, no rub marks on saplings. The trackway behaved like travel, not hunting. After several hundred yards, the trees thinned and the hillside opened into a narrow gap where sandstone pushed out of the earth in a vertical face. The rock rose almost straight up from the slope, weathered into a pale wall with dark streaks where runoff had carved paths down its surface. The last clear footprint sat at the base, toes pointed directly at the stone. Trackway terminated at rock face. No jump marks, no scramble gouges observed on approach slope. From the sheriff's incident report, Raymond expected in that moment to find a turn, a pivot, a set of prints doubling back. If it was a bear, it would either circle for a way around or show signs of climbing where the rock offered holds. There were no holds. Above the final print, a wet smear streaked upward on the sandstone, darker than the surrounding surface, glossy as if something viscous had been pressed against it and dragged straight up. The streak was not runoff. It started at a height consistent with the last print and rose in a narrow band, too direct, too intentional. Then Raymond saw what made his stomach go tight. Faint partial impressions appeared on the vertical rock face itself. Not full prints, but pad shapes and toe outlines pressed into the surface at intervals, each one placed above the last as if the trackway continued upward in the air. The spacing did not match a leap. It matched climbing. The prints rose to roughly the height of a tall person's shoulders, then stopped abruptly, as if whatever had been climbing simply left the wall without needing a ledge. Raymond did what people do when they realize their own assumptions about physics are being challenged. He stared longer than he should have. He leaned closer. He searched for a trick of light that would restore the world to something explainable. The smear on the rock glistened despite the cold. I watched the tracks go straight into the stone and then keep going up like the wall was a trail. From Raymond Coates's written statement, Nolan circled the base, scanning for a crack or a hidden slope. He found nothing. The rock face was bare enough that even a skilled climber would have needed gear. The few shrubs that grew near it were bent down by snow, leaving no high branches for an animal to launch from. Raymond took photographs with his phone, hands already numb from the cold and from the sensation of documenting something he did not want to own. The images showed the last print clearly. They showed the wet streak. The vertical impressions were harder to capture because they existed more as a change in texture than a change in color. They decided to back out and call it in, not as a cryptid claim, but as a safety issue. Large unknown animal sign near public land, potential threat to hikers and hunters. The sheriff's office took it seriously enough to send a deputy with a camera and sample kit. 2 more vehicles arrived behind him, tires grinding on the logging road, doors closing with the blunt finality of procedure. The deputies documented the trackway, photographed the scale of the prints, and then focused on the wet smear and the marks on the rock. The smear had not dried, even though a breeze moved steadily through the gap. It retained a slick shine, like mucus. The lead deputy used a sterile swab and a small vial, collecting material from the darkest portion of the streak where it pooled in a shallow, natural groove in the sandstone. Slimy residue collected from rock face, odor described as metallic, iron-like. From the scene examination protocol, the smell was noted by more than one person. It did not smell like blood exactly. It smelled adjacent to blood, like pennies and wet rust, sharp enough to sit in the back of the throat. It lingered on gloves and seemed to intensify when the sample warmed slightly inside the sealed vial. A short distance from the rock face on the trunk of a mature fir, the bark had been stripped in vertical bands at a height that made no sense for a bear. The torn sections began above a person's head and ran higher. Beneath the stripped bark, the pale wood showed long gouges that looked like drag marks, as if something with strength and length had pulled itself upward without needing a normal climbing posture. The deputies measured those marks too. They photographed them with a ruler held against the trunk. They checked nearby trees for similar damage. The pattern repeated on 2 other trunks along the approach line, as if the same subject had tested its grip while moving toward the rock. Tree scoring observed at heights above normal reach. Gouge orientation consistent with upward dragging motion. From the supplemental field notes, by the time the sample reached a regional lab through normal channels, the paperwork was already careful. It described the substance as clear, viscous, and unusually resistant to drying. It noted trace minerals at elevated levels. It did not assign a biological source with confidence. It did not list a known animal that produced such residue. The official explanation that ultimately entered the file used familiar words: misidentified bear sign, melting snow distortion, unusual runoff patterns, natural staining on sandstone. Raymond read those lines later and understood why they were there. Files needed a box to live in. The system preferred a wrong answer to an open question, but there were details the box could not hold. The toe spacing, the step length, the lack of scramble marks, the fact that the vertical impressions followed a clean, consistent line, like a trackway continuing up an invisible path. I smelled it when they swabbed the rock, and it clung to my nose like metal. From Deputy S. Mallory's field statement, Raymond changed the way he hunted after that, not in a dramatic way. No sudden belief systems, no confessional speeches. He simply stopped hunting alone. He started carrying a small headlamp, even in daylight. He began choosing routes with clear sight lines and avoiding narrow gaps, where rock faces rose into blind corners. He also returned to the outcrop once, months later, in late spring when the ground was bare and the creek beds ran high with snowmelt. He found no prints, no trackway, no fresh torn bark, but the smear on the sandstone remained faintly visible as a darker band, like a stain that had sunk into the stone rather than sitting on top of it. When he touched the rock, the surface felt normal, dry, cool. The memory, however, stayed slick and bright in his mind, a reminder that whatever made those prints did not treat gravity as a fixed rule. Archival transition. The trackway ended where stone should have ended it. The next report began with a dog that refused to cross an invisible line at the forest edge and reacted as if the air itself had become a barrier. Mara Ellis made her living on other people's worst days. She was a volunteer handler for a county search unit, the type of person who kept spare leads, medical tape, and electrolyte packets in the trunk year-round. Her dog, Coda, was a trained shepherd with a work drive that bordered on stubbornness. When the harness went on, he pushed through briars, water, and noise, with the steady focus of an animal that understood task and reward. He was not a skittish dog. He did not freeze at gunfire. He did not flinch at sirens. He did not hesitate at unstable footing. In training, he had learned to cross bridges that swayed and climb through culverts that smelled like rot. He had also learned to ignore distractions, including wildlife and unfamiliar humans, because work was work. That was why Mara remembered the afternoon it happened with a clarity that felt unfair. It was mid-spring, a day bright enough to look harmless. She took Coda off duty to stretch him out on an unofficial trail that skirted a wetland hollow on the edge of a managed forest. The ground there was soft and springy, layered with moss that held moisture like a sponge. Roots crossed the path like exposed veins. Bird noise filled the canopy in overlapping bursts, and the air carried that mild, cold green smell of thawing soil. They were not searching for anyone. There was no call-out, no urgency, just a walk. The trail bent toward a stand of spruce where the understory thickened and the light changed. The trees were close enough together that the shade looked stitched into one continuous band. 10 meters from the first trunk, Coda slowed as if he had encountered a physical obstacle. His tail lowered, not tucked under in fear, but dropped in a way Mara recognized as concentrate attention. His ears went forward, his pace shortened. Then he stopped. He did not plant his feet and pull against the leash the way an excited dog might. He stopped dead, weight evenly distributed, body rigid as if braced against pressure. He refused all forward movement once he reached the tree boundary. From the canine behavior report, Mara responded the way training had taught her to respond. She gave the usual cue sequence, the same one she used when Coda hesitated at a culvert or a dark stairwell. A hand signal, a gentle harness pressure forward, a calm directive voice, measured and familiar. Coda did not move. Instead, his head dipped slightly and his stare fixed on a single point just inside the shade between two trunks, as if something stood there and held his attention like a magnet. His lips began to tighten, the corners of his mouth wrinkled. Not a bark, not a growl yet, a restrained warning withheld by discipline. Then he did something Mara had never seen him do on a harnessed line. He backed up. It was not a turn away, not a sideways retreat. It was a straight, deliberate reverse, step by step, eyes never leaving that same point in the trees. He moved like a dog avoiding a trap he could smell but could not see. Mara felt her own throat tighten. She paused, listening for anything she might have missed. A rattlesnake, a trapped animal, a person concealed in brush. But the forest offered only the normal layered noises of spring. Then the sound dropped out. It did not fade, it cut. For a fraction of a moment, the background went thin and hollow, as if the world had been muted. The sensation was physical, like sudden pressure behind the ears. And then the noise returned in a snap. Birds again. Wind in needles again. A distant woodpecker again. Her phone was in her jacket pocket running a recording app, not because she expected anything, but because she had a habit of documenting unusual conditions for training review. Later, when the file was extracted, the pattern appeared as clean valleys in the waveform. Ambient audio drops recorded in 3 distinct intervals near treeline. From the extracted phone audio file, Mara tried again, taking one slow step forward. Coda's body tensed hard enough that the harness straps creaked. He issued a low, continuous whine that did not sound like fear. It sounded like protest, directed at something that did not belong. As her boot crossed an invisible line in the moss, the sound dropped out again. Not silence in the poetic sense. A band of near absence, like the recording had lost its environment track, while her own breathing remained faintly present. Her stomach tightened with the strange feeling of being observed in a place where observation should have been impossible. She stepped back. The sound returned. She shifted left, attempting to approach the stand of spruce from a different angle. Coda pivoted immediately and placed his body between her and the boundary, shoulder angled like a guard. His hackles rose along his spine. His stare stayed locked on the same point, even though Mara's angle changed. It was as if the point moved with them, or as if it did not need to move at all. I could not pull him forward without dragging him, and he never took his eyes off that one spot. From Mara Ellis's after-action statement, Mara made the decision she always told new handlers to make when instinct and training collided. She stopped forcing the approach. She backed away with Coda, keeping her movements controlled and slow, as if she were leaving a hazardous area rather than turning away from a patch of trees. Once they were several yards back, Coda's posture eased slightly. He did not relax. He simply stopped resisting. His eyes shifted from that single point to Mara's face for the first time, and the look was not panic. It was insistence. The message was clear without words. Do not cross. Mara marked the location anyway because procedure was a form of safety. She tied a strip of survey tape to a branch at the edge of the trail, then added a second strip lower down. She noted the approximate location with a handheld GPS unit she kept in her pack. The coordinates recorded normally on her device, but the map overlay in her app failed to render a section of the hollow behind the tree line, loading as blank tiles for several seconds before returning. She did not linger long enough to test it further. A small team returned the next day with better equipment and a wider purpose. Treat it as an environmental anomaly first, a threat second, and a story last. They took soil photographs and measured the site like they would a potential search area hazard. They walked the perimeter without entering the deeper shade. There were no human footprints, no recent animal trail, no evidence of a camp, no broken branches at shoulder height, no cigarette butts, no trash, no cut saplings, nothing that would explain why a trained dog had refused to do what he had been trained to do. What they did find was directly in front of the spot where Coda had fixed his attention. A circular patch of moss was pressed down evenly, as if something broad and heavy had stood very still there for a long time without shifting. The depression had no clear toe marks, no hoof outlines, no boot edges. It looked like weight without movement, presence without steps. Localized area of depressed moss observed. No identifiable tracks within compression zone. From the environmental survey note, they photographed it and placed scale markers. They tested moisture and found the compressed patch held slightly more water than the surrounding moss, as if heat or pressure had altered the structure. They found a few strands of fine fiber caught on a low twig near the boundary, too thin to identify in the field, pale and slick when wet. The phone recording from Mara's hike was reviewed by a technician familiar with outdoor audio. The file did not show interference tones or electronic clipping. It showed 3 distinct dropouts, each aligned with Mara's approach toward the tree line. In the spectrum view, it appeared less like noise suppression and more like an absence of recorded ambient energy, as if the environment itself had briefly failed to register. No mechanical cause identified for 3 short ambient dropouts, pattern correlated with proximity to marked boundary. From the audio review summary, Mara returned once more alone, without Coda, standing at a safe distance where the trail still held sunlight. She did not step forward. She simply watched the tree line and listened to the normal sounds of the forest, trying to convince her body that nothing had happened. Coda, at home, refused to take the lead from the hook that had been used on that hike. He did not bite it or snarl at it. He simply avoided it, choosing another leash with deliberate care. For weeks afterward, whenever Mara drove near that part of the forest, Coda lifted his head and watched the window as if tracking a scent that did not exist inside the car. Mara did not file it as a cryptid report. She filed it as an operational hazard, a boundary that disrupted a working animal's behavior and produced repeatable anomalies in recorded ambient sound. It was the kind of phrasing that let the file stay in the system without requiring anyone to admit what it felt like. At home, she printed the waveform and pinned it to her refrigerator. 3 shallow valleys cut clean into a band of forest noise, each one a reminder that something had defined a line in those trees. Coda had seen it first, and he had decided, with the calm certainty of a professional, that crossing that line would cost more than any search could justify. Archival transition. The forest drew a boundary that a trained dog refused to cross. The next report came from an empty road where a shadow entered the headlight beam and then rose higher than the hood, matching a vehicle without leaving a single footprint. Caleb North drove an aging sedan home from a late shift at a small machining shop that ran second and third rotation when orders stacked up. He was not the kind of man who chased stories. He kept his fuel receipts in the console, his maintenance notes in a glove box folder, and his eyes on the road because rural highways punished distraction without warning. That night, the air was cold and clear enough to make every reflector look sharper than it should have. Recent rain had left the shoulders soft and dark, with pooled water in the ditches and a thin sheen on the blacktop that caught headlight glare in a smooth, oily band. Caleb stayed on a 2-lane county route that threaded through pine stands and open drainage cuts, choosing it because it was faster than the highway and usually empty after midnight. His dash camera ran automatically. He rarely reviewed its footage unless someone brake-checked him or a deer jumped. He kept his high beams on through long stretches, dipping only for the rare oncoming vehicle. The road ahead formed a tunnel of light and shadow, the trees on either side compressing into a continuous wall of black. Then his headlights picked out a shape on the right shoulder. At first it read as ordinary danger. A black bear, broad-backed, hunched low at the edge of the beam where details were always unreliable. It was positioned just far enough from the asphalt to be believable, a dark lump against darker brush, with the slight illusion of fur catching light in dull swaths. Caleb eased off the accelerator without braking hard, the way he had been taught to do on slick rural pavement. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, not from panic but from calculation. He watched the shoulder and measured distance, waiting for the moment the shape would turn away or drop into the ditch. Instead, the shape rose. It did not rear up the way a startled animal might. It uncoiled as if it had been folded, lifting higher than it should have been able to lift in a single smooth motion. The silhouette lengthened until it stood taller than his hood, by a full head, shoulders narrowing into a vertical outline that still held something wrong around the limbs. In the dashcam footage later, the moment looked like a mistake in scale. A figure that should have been lower remained high, as if the proportions had been stretched upward without changing width. I watched it stand up, and it ended higher than my hood line, like it had joints where they should not be. From Caleb North's voice memo, recorded after the incident, the shadow turned slightly, keeping itself in the marginal slice of light where a camera struggled to resolve edges. It did not step into the lane. It did not bolt into the trees. It stayed parallel to his car, moving as if the road had given it a track beside him. Caleb kept his gaze mostly forward, relying on peripheral vision the way defensive driving instructors insisted. Fixating on the shoulder would pull the wheel. Looking too long would invite a mistake. He tried to treat the silhouette like wildlife. Do not swerve, do not brake hard, do not do anything sudden. The shape matched his speed. Its position stayed constant in relation to his passenger side headlight beam. When Caleb drifted slightly toward the center line to give the shoulder more room, the silhouette maintained the same lateral distance, adjusting without visible effort. It looked less like a body running and more like a cutout sliding along a rail. The muddy shoulder should have shown movement. The rain had softened the edge into a trackable surface, the kind that kept every boot tread and paw pad. Yet beneath the silhouette, no footfalls registered. There was no up-down rhythm of gait, no alternating stride. The lower half remained indistinct and strangely still. The dash camera captured the phenomenon in a way that later reviewers described as consistent and sustained, not a brief blur. I reviewed the clip, and the silhouette held a constant offset from the vehicle for the full segment, without a visible stride cycle. From the dashcam analyst's recorded review, note Caleb tested it in small, controlled ways. He reduced speed by a few miles per hour, careful not to brake, then returned to his previous pace. The silhouette adjusted with him, staying anchored in the same slice of beam. He increased speed slightly. The silhouette increased as well. That was the first moment his rational explanations began to fail. If it was an animal, it should have either fallen behind or cut away. If it was a person, the shoulder mud should have shown steps. If it was a trick of light, it should have shifted when his speed changed. His mouth went dry. He felt his heartbeat in his throat. He forced himself not to look directly at it for more than a fraction of a second at a time. Each glance gave him only partial information, never enough to label it. In one glance, it seemed narrow at the waist and too broad at the shoulders. In another, it looked like it had an elongated upper torso and arms that hung too long, but the frame never held long enough to confirm it. A stretch of road dipped slightly, bringing the ditch water closer to headlight level. The beam reflected off pooled water and threw ripples of light upward, briefly outlining the silhouette's edge. The outline did not behave like a normal shadow. It did not soften at the margins. It held its shape with a crispness that looked more like a solid body blocking light than an absence of it. Caleb passed a crossroad marked by a single reflector post and a mailbox cluster. Ahead, a farmhouse sat back from the road with a porch light burning steady. The presence of human light should have broken whatever spell the highway held. As the car approached the point where the farmhouse was fully visible, Caleb allowed himself one longer glance to the right. The shoulder was empty. The beam swept over wet grass and black mud and the pale glint of water in the ditch. There was no upright form, no bear, no person, no movement in the trees. The transition was not gradual. It was simply gone, as if the act of reaching a lit patch of civilization had erased it. I looked over when I reached the first house light, and there was nothing there, like it had never existed beside me. From Caleb North's written statement, Caleb did not stop immediately. He kept driving until his hands stopped shaking enough to make safe decisions. Several miles later, he pulled into a wider shoulder near an access gate, parked with his headlights washing the ditch line, and sat for a full minute, listening to his own breathing. He replayed the dashcam clip on his phone through the camera's app. The footage showed what he had seen, but it did not explain it. The silhouette tracked his car with a steady precision, as if distance and timing were the point of the exercise. Caleb called the local non-emergency line and reported a possible large animal or roadside hazard, keeping his language practical. He did not say cryptid. He did not say impossible. He said there was a tall figure on the shoulder that had moved in a way he could not account for. He offered to show footage. A deputy met him later along the route and walked the area with a flashlight while Caleb stayed near the car. The shoulder mud was still soft. The ditch still held water. The deputy moved slowly, scanning for tracks the way experienced patrol did when confirming a deer strike or a trespasser's path. They found no clear footprints, no paw prints, no boot tread, no scuff marks or slides, no broken weeds indicating a body had moved through them. The absence was as disturbing as any sign could have been, because the surface should have recorded something. I walked the right shoulder from the marker post to the crossroad, and I did not see a single track consistent with a person or bear. From the deputy's body cam narration, what they did find was one impression. It sat a short distance off the asphalt near the point where the dashcam timestamp showed the silhouette first becoming visible. It was a single deep dent in the soft earth, as if something very heavy had crouched or settled its weight there briefly. The impression did not resemble a standard paw, and it did not resemble a boot. It was more like a broad pad with irregular edges, sunk far enough that water had begun to pool in the deepest part. There were no follow-up impressions leading away, no approach prints, no departure prints, just the one. The deputy photographed it with a scale marker, then attempted a simple field cast. The earth was too saturated to hold clean edges. The impression slumped at the margins, but the depth remained unusually pronounced compared to anything in the surrounding shoulder. I measured the depth against nearby soil, and it was deeper than a normal step would sink, like a heavy weight loaded in one spot. From the deputy's supplemental audio note, Caleb's car showed no damage, no hair on the bumper, no smear on the side panels, no contact marks on the mirror. the evidence stayed limited to what the case file would later call partial confirmation, a dash cam clip with a sustained silhouette, a field response documenting a lack of tracks where tracks should have existed, and one isolated depression that did not fit known prints. The county filed it under roadside hazard and unusual sign. The report language stayed conservative. Caleb's footage was copied and archived. No public bulletin went out. No wildlife officer claimed jurisdiction. Caleb changed his habits anyway. He began taking the longer route home, the one with more houses and fewer blind stretches. The extra miles cost him sleep, but sleep came easier when the shoulder was not a continuous wall of dark. He also adjusted his dash camera settings to keep longer clips and higher sensitivity, not because he wanted to capture something again, but because he feared the alternative, that the only reason the silhouette had vanished cleanly was because it had chosen to. In the weeks that followed, Caleb noticed something small that he could not prove mattered, but could not stop thinking about. The dash cam clip's metadata showed a brief audio flattening during the exact segment when the silhouette kept pace, a subtle reduction in ambient road noise that made the engine hum sound slightly isolated, as if the environment had been dampened around him. It was not definitive. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of detail that felt like a system artifact rather than a ghost story, and that was what stayed with him most, not the shape itself. The precision, the way it had paced his beam like it was matching a calibration test, keeping distance constant, staying in the edge of view, leaving almost nothing behind except one deep impression in mud and a clip that made every rational explanation feel thin. Archival transition on an empty road, something kept pace without leaving tracks. The next report came from a cabin door marked with wet circular prints and a roofline pressed down as if a weight had listened from above for hours. Elliot Hart kept a cabin on a quiet lakeshore because the place made it easy to forget the city. The road in was a mix of gravel and old asphalt, the kind that turned to slurry after a week of rain. The cabin itself was plain and practical. One story, a low-pitched roof, a narrow porch, and a front door that faced the water as if it had been built to watch the shoreline. He arrived in the first half of autumn, after several days of steady storms that had swollen the lake and knocked leaves loose early. The air smelled like wet cedar and tannins, and the shoreline weeds lay flattened as if something heavy had pressed through them in the dark. The first thing he noticed was not the lake. It was his front door. Two vertical columns of dark circles patterned the wood on either side of the door frame. Each circle was roughly the size of a child's fist, edges sharply defined where moisture had darkened the grain, like stamps pressed hard and clean. They began near the handle height and rose higher than Elliot's head, maintaining a spacing so regular it looked measured rather than accidental. He leaned close and saw that some circles had faint runnels between them, thin streaks where something wet had pulled away and slid downward. There was no paint peeled, no gouging, no splinters. The door looked intact, only marked. Circular impressions appeared in two straight columns with uniform spacing as if applied deliberately. From Elliot Hart's written incident, note Elliot tried to solve it the way he solved everything. Start with the obvious. He checked the porch boards for muddy footprints. The rain had left a film of grit on the wood, but there were no boot edges, no toe scuffs, no drag marks. He stepped off the porch into the soaked soil near the foundation and looked for tracks there. The ground was soft enough to hold detail. He found only his own. He reached for the handle and immediately regretted it. The metal was slick with a thin residue that clung to his skin with a tacky pull. It felt like diluted glue or mucus, not thick enough to bead, but enough to leave a translucent smear on his fingertips. When he rubbed his fingers together, it resisted the way sap resisted, though it lacked sap's sharp pine smell. He wiped his hand on a rag and went inside without standing in the doorway longer than necessary. Once the cabin heater kicked on, he told himself it was vandalism. Teenagers, a sick joke, someone with suction toys and time to waste. That explanation sat comfortably in the mind because it implied a human cause and a human limit. Then he looked up at the roofline from the back window and saw something else. A broad oval patch of shingles above the main room had been pressed down slightly, not shattered, not punctured, simply compressed. The pattern looked like weight that had settled and stayed, long enough for materials to yield slowly. It was the opposite of impact damage. It suggested patience. He stepped outside and circled the cabin, scanning the eaves and gutters for a fallen branch. The surrounding trees were tall fir and spruce, their limbs heavy with wet needles. Storms did break branches, but storm damage was chaotic. This was specific. Near the tree line behind the cabin, one high branch on a fir had snapped clean at a height that would have required a ladder or a second story. The exposed wood was bright and fresh, stark against dark bark. The broken tip lay on the ground several yards away, not beneath the trunk. It looked dropped, not fallen. Fresh break noted on upper limb at height, inconsistent with ground access, with branch section displaced away from trunk. From the property inspection photo set caption, Elliot did not sleep well that first night. The rain softened to mist, and wind rolled off the lake in slow waves. Every cabin has its sounds, its normal settling and creaking. Elliot had learned them over the years. He knew the difference between a mouse in the wall and a gust under the eaves. That night, the roof sounded wrong. There were intervals where the usual vibration of wind over shingles seemed muted, as if something broad and soft pressed down and dampened the sound. The effect lasted for a few seconds at a time, then released with a faint creak like a slow exhale in wood. He got up once and stood in the dark living room, listening with his breath held. The pressure returned. The roofline quieted. Then very faintly came a sound at the front door that reminded him of a wet suction cup being peeled from glass. He did not open anything. He did not go outside. I heard a faint peel squeak near the front door like wet rubber releasing, and then the cabin went still again. From Elliot Hart's voice memo recorded before dawn by morning, he convinced himself the sound had been imagination shaped by stress. He made coffee, forced routine into place, and started documenting what he could. He photographed the door circles from multiple angles with a scale reference. He photographed the residue smear on the handle after lightly touching it with a cotton swab. He photographed the roof depressions from the yard and the snapped branch at the tree line. He kept the language neutral in his notes, using words like pattern and residue and indentation instead of any creature name. He called his insurance company and framed it as possible vandalism and possible storm-related roof damage. That language had a path through systems. An adjuster arrived 2 days later after the rain returned in hard bands. The adjuster wore overshoes and carried a clipboard that looked too clean for the mud. He inspected the door first, then the roof. He asked about ladders, about neighbors, about whether Elliot had seen anyone on the property. Elliot showed him the lack of footprints and the branch break. The adjuster did not argue. He did not speculate. He measured. He counted the circles' spacing, noted their alignment, and photographed the residue with a flashlight angled low to catch sheen. He took roof measurements and wrote down the dimensions of the compressed patch, using careful words like static load and prolonged pressure. Roof indentation patterns suggested sustained weight rather than strike, with no corresponding debris field. From the insurance assessor's field notes, the adjuster collected a small sample of residue from the handle and one of the darker door circles with a sterile swab kit, then sealed it in a plastic tube the way evidence techs did on television. He said it would be sent to a lab that handled environmental contamination claims. The tone implied algae, mold, or chemical spill. Elliot wanted it to be algae. Algae belonged to water. It had rules. The lab report came back in a week in the sterile language of partial answers. The residue tested as organic, protein-rich, with trace mineral content that suggested lake water contact, but the chemical profile did not match common household contaminants. The report listed similarities to mucus secretions and adhesive biological films found in certain aquatic organisms, yet nothing in the report could explain how such material had been deposited in evenly spaced circles on a door several steps above the ground. Organic adhesive compound detected with trace mineral signature, consistent with freshwater exposure. Source not identified. From the laboratory summary sheet, Elliot forwarded the report to a local wildlife officer he knew by reputation, a man who handled nuisance bears and illegal baiting complaints. The officer came out as a courtesy and walked the property with the same practical skepticism most rural officials carried like a tool. He inspected the door, the roof, the snapped branch. He walked the shoreline and looked for evidence of a large animal hauling out of the water. He found flattened weeds and drift lines from the storm surge, nothing more. He did not find drag marks, no belly slides, no claw sign. The officer did something Elliot did not expect. He went quiet and held his hand up near the door circles without touching them, as if he could feel something with air alone. Then he stepped back and looked at the upper circles again, where the marks reached higher than Elliot could comfortably touch. He asked whether anyone else had keys. Elliot said no. The officer looked at the roof depressions and then at the lake, and his voice stayed controlled when he suggested Elliot install cameras and motion lights. He did not say it was nothing. Height and placement did not match typical vandalism patterns, and there was no ladder sign in saturated soil. From the wildlife officer's follow-up note, Elliot installed a camera under the eave, facing the porch, and a second one aimed at the roofline. He set them to record on motion and to stamp time. He mounted a motion light above the door. For several nights, the cameras captured only rain and shifting shadows. The motion light triggered on wind-blown branches and wandering raccoons. The roof camera showed nothing but water streaks and occasional fog rolling in from the lake like breath. Then, on a night when the wind was low and the lake was mirror still, Elliot woke again to that muffled pressure on the roof, the same dampening of sound as if a weight had settled over the main room. He checked the cameras the next morning. The porch camera showed normal image, normal timestamp, then a full minute of corrupted gray static, then normal image again. The roof camera showed the same gap, as if both devices had blinked at once. The motion light log showed no activation during that minute. Both cameras recorded a simultaneous 1-minute corruption window, with no motion trigger logged. From Elliot Hart's equipment, Log Elliot did not try to explain the minute. He simply wrote it down and stared at the door. The circles had faded in the dry days after the first discovery, becoming pale ghosts in the wood grain. But on damp mornings when mist rose off the lake and the porch boards darkened with moisture, the circles returned with a faint, visible bloom, as if the door remembered the pattern and the weather re-inked it. The effect was worse after nights when Elliot heard the roof go quiet under that soft pressure. He replaced the door by the end of the season. He told himself it was for insulation, for security, for peace of mind. He kept the old door stored in the shed, leaning against the wall, covered in a tarp. In winter, when the shed warmed slightly in sun and then cooled fast at dusk, condensation formed on the tarp's underside. Elliot checked once, unable to resist the impulse. Even through the tarp, dark circles showed faintly where the old door's wood had absorbed something that refused to leave. The marks did not look fresh. They looked set, like a mold of contact that could be awakened whenever moisture returned. Elliot stopped coming to the cabin alone. He invited friends. He stayed in town when storms rolled in. He installed heavier roof bracing and told himself it was for snow load. But the thing that changed him most was not the damage. It was the implication behind the pattern. Those circles had not been random smears. They had been placed like grips arranged at heights that suggested climbing or bracing, as if something had held the door and listened through it. The roof depressions were not a landing, they were a rest, a long, patient wait positioned above the room where a human would sleep. The cabin had never felt haunted in the old theatrical sense. It had felt observed in a way that was quieter and more procedural. It had felt like something had tested where the weak points were. Archival transition. The door held marks like contact points, and the roof held the shape of a listener. The next file began in a wetland hollow, where a child's crying voice learned names, corrected itself, and led searchers to a boot that had no approach tracks at all. Andre Navarro and Kelly Rist had taken the marsh boardwalk because it was the cleanest way back to their car. They were not looking for wildlife, not filming content, not chasing a thrill. They had spent the afternoon on dry trails, and by the time they reached the wetlands, the light had thinned into that flat, coppery dusk that made water look like tarnished metal. The boardwalk ran straight for a while, then angled through reeds that rose shoulder-high on either side. The air smelled of peat and decaying leaves. Every few yards, a post-mounted sign reminded visitors to stay on the planks. The park still felt open, but the wetland already carried the quiet of closing time, as if the place began shutting itself down before the staff did. Kelly had her phone in her hand out of habit, not because she expected anything worth recording. Andre kept his hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the damp. They were near the middle span when the first sound reached them from the reeds. It was a child's crying voice, thin and unsteady, rising and breaking as if the speaker could not breathe through the sobs. It did not sound far away. It sounded close enough that a wrong step off the boards would put them in the water within seconds. Neither of them moved at first. The wetland was known for sinkholes and soft mud. A person could disappear waist-deep without warning, especially in low light. Even with the boards under their feet, Andre felt the instinctive hesitation that came with hearing distress where rescue was difficult. Kelly began recording without thinking about it. The phone's tiny microphone captured reeds clicking in the breeze, distant insects, and the cry threading through everything like a needle. I heard a kid crying right beside the boardwalk, but the water never moved. From Kelly Rist's voice note recorded after the incident, the crying continued, then tightened into something more structured, as if it were trying to form words. Andre could not make out sentences, but he heard repeated syllables that might have been pleas. The sound shifted position without any splash, without reeds bending, without the wet slap of a foot stepping into shallow water. Andre glanced down between the boards. The marsh below was black and still. He looked ahead and saw fog pooling in a low sheet, collecting around the posts like smoke that refused to rise. The farther end of the boardwalk was visible but softened, the straight lines of wood turning uncertain in the haze. The next change was small, but it hit harder than the crying itself. The voice stopped sobbing for a moment, like a person gathering breath, and then spoke a name with startling clarity. Andre's name. Not shouted, not mangled. Said the way someone who knew him would say it, with the same local cadence he heard from co-workers and friends. It said my name cleanly, and it was not a child's voice anymore. From the 911 call summary notes, Andre felt the hairs lift along his forearms. Kelly's eyes widened, and she tightened her grip on the phone until her knuckles paled. Neither of them had introduced themselves to anyone on that trail. They had passed no hikers on the boardwalk. The nearest parking lot was a long walk behind them. Kelly's recording later showed what her ears already knew in the moment. The pitch dropped, the rhythm changed, and the breathing became controlled. The sound stopped being a child in distress and became an adult shaping a lure. Audio transitions from juvenile cry characteristics to adult male cadence across the captured segment. From the laboratory review report, the voice repeated Andre's name again, and then used Kelly's, pronouncing it correctly without hesitation, as if it had tested the sounds before letting them out. The reeds did not move. Andre and Kelly did not step off the boards. They did what people did when the mind tried to keep the world stable. They looked for the simplest explanation, then watched it collapse. Kelly kept the phone pointed toward the reeds, recording, while Andre scanned for anything that could carry a voice. A hidden speaker, a person crouched low, a prank device strapped to a post. He saw only wet leaves, dark water, and reed stems that stood too still. They began walking faster, not running, careful with footing. The boardwalk planks were slick with moisture. The voice followed their movement, never raising volume, never sounding out of breath, never needing to pause for air in the way a real person would. Halfway down the span, Kelly's phone camera shook as she spotted something on the boards ahead. A child's rain jacket lay crumpled near the edge of the planks, bright fabric dulled by mud and water. It looked newly dropped, still wet enough to glisten. The sleeves were turned slightly inside out, as if it had been pulled off in a hurry. Andre crouched without touching it. He looked for small footprints, for scuffed plank grit, for mud trails that showed a child had climbed onto the boardwalk. There were none. The jacket sat there like a placed object, not a forgotten one. The voice in the reeds stopped crying entirely. It held steady, adult, and began speaking their names in a pattern, as if checking which sound got a reaction. Kelly's recording caught another detail. The wetland noise dipped out in brief windows as though the environment itself was muting so the voice could be heard more cleanly. Ambient audio dropped to near silence in multiple intervals, while the voice remained present. From the extracted phone audio analysis, Andre and Kelly left the jacket where it was. They moved past it and forced themselves to keep walking. The far end of the boardwalk drew closer, and the fog thickened until the posts looked like pale silhouettes. Andre's stomach tightened with the irrational fear that the exit would not be there when they reached it. The voice used Andre's name again, and then added something else. A calm, adult tone that carried the shape of reassurance. It sounded like someone trying to guide them off the boards, toward the reeds, toward the water that waited under the grass. They did not follow. They kept to the planks and made it to the far end. At the trail junction where the ground turned solid and gravel replaced wet wood, Kelly's phone lost signal completely. The screen remained lit, but the status icons flickered and then froze, as if time and location had stalled together. Andre called emergency services. The connection held just long enough for a location description and a report of a possible missing child near the boardwalk. When the dispatcher later reviewed the audio file Kelly submitted, one detail stood out. The captured segment lasted only about a minute, yet the phone's metadata showed a brief gap, as if the device had stopped registering time while still recording sound. Recording duration and a device time stamps showed an irregular segment consistent with a short time freeze. From the incident intake technician notes, rangers reached the trailhead that evening, but the wetland search was limited by safety protocols. No one was sent into chest-high reeds in fog without daylight and proper equipment. They flagged the boardwalk and told Andre and Kelly to wait at the parking area for statements. By morning, a small team returned with waders, poles, and a tracking dog kept on a short lead for boardwalk work. The jacket was still there on the planks, exactly where Andre and Kelly had described it. No one had reported a missing child overnight. Nearby towns had no matching call. A few yards off the boardwalk, half submerged in mud near a reed cluster, the team found a small shoe tilted on its side. It was the kind of child's boot that should have left a neat trail of prints leading to it. The ground around it held no inbound footprints. What it did show was a narrow disturbance line, as if something had been dragged along the mud in a straight pull toward open water. The line ended at the marsh edge where the vegetation grew too thick to read without stepping off stable ground. Juvenile footwear recovered with no approach tracks. Linear drag disturbance terminated at waterline. From the ranger incident form, the dog refused to move closer to the drag line. It did not bark. It simply planted its feet, strained against the harness, and began to whine in a fixed direction, nose pointed at reeds that appeared ordinary. Searchers probed the marsh with poles. They found soft mud and buried roots. They did not find a body. They did not find clothing beyond the jacket and the shoe. They did not find blood or broken reeds or a path where a child could have walked. The only human prints documented near the scene were those of the rangers and investigators, stamped into the boardwalk grit and shoreline mud after daylight. The lab report on Kelly's audio did not claim certainty. It used careful phrases, the kind that let professionals file a conclusion without inviting ridicule. It noted the clear change in formant structure from juvenile to adult male. It noted the improbability of a single speaker shifting so drastically without electronic assistance. It noted the absence of known amplification sources in the area and the clean capture of names that were not spoken on record before the voice used them. The report did not assign a cause. Andre and Kelly returned to normal life. With a new rule, they did not discuss much with friends. They did not walk wetlands at dusk. They did not leave boardwalks for any sound, no matter how human it seemed. Andre later admitted the worst part was not fear for a missing child, but the moment the voice changed, because that shift suggested attention. It suggested adjustment. It suggested that whatever made the sound had tested one approach, then changed tactics when it learned what worked. It started as crying, then it sounded like it was thinking, like it was trying on different voices. From Andre Navarro's follow-up written statement. For weeks afterward, when Andre heard a child cry in a store or at a park, his first reaction was not concern. It was a cold, involuntary pause, the memory of reeds that never moved, and a voice that spoke his name without needing a body to carry it. Archival transition. The marsh used helplessness as a mask, then switched to certainty when it learned their names. The next file came from a roadside call where the dispatcher's answer appeared in the recording before the receiver was ever lifted. The anomaly was not discovered in the moment. It surfaced the way most expensive mistakes surfaced in a county system, with too few staff and too many calls. During an audit, weeks later, when someone finally had the time to listen closely. Supervisor Marlene Ives had been in emergency communications long enough to distrust anything that looked clean on paper. She reviewed recordings for compliance, liability, and patterns that could turn into training. The call she flagged had already been tagged as unresolved. A rural disconnect with responding units arriving to an empty scene. It should have been filed, summarized, and forgotten. Instead, it refused to sit still in the timeline. The caller was a woman in her 30s, alone in her vehicle on a connector road that cut through timber and low marshland. The official log described it with typical restraint. Unknown subject near roadway. Caller distressed. Connection lost. Vehicle located. Caller not located. The audio file should have matched the log. It did not. When Marlene played it back, she heard the dispatcher's greeting begin before the system indicated the call had even opened. The recording carried the calm, practiced cadence of an operator, answering a ringing line at a moment when the timestamp still showed the line as idle. Dispatcher response audible approximately 4 seconds prior to registered call initiation. From the internal recording analysis report at first, Marlene assumed a software drift. Systems buffered sound. Clocks disagreed by fractions of seconds. A human ear could be fooled by pre-roll. She pulled the raw file instead of the compressed playback. She checked the server time reference. She compared the same call in two separate archiving systems that were supposed to start recording only after connection. The offset remained 4 seconds. It was not a rounding error. It was a clean lead, as if the dispatcher's voice had stepped out ahead of the call and waited there. Marlene escalated it to the county's radio and recording technician, who ran it through their analysis tools. The waveform showed the dispatcher's greeting, forming a complete phrase, with no sign of being clipped or spliced. There was no jump, no cut, no second track layered in later. The file was continuous. The caller's voice entered a few seconds after the greeting had already begun, overlapping it in a way that made the conversation feel like two timelines trying to occupy the same line. It sounded like the answer was already in progress when the caller's voice appeared. From the auditor's review notes, the dispatcher on duty that night, a veteran operator named Tessa Ward, had no memory of anything unusual beyond the dropped line. She had handled hundreds of calls in similar corridors. She remembered the woman's tone, the strained attempt to stay composed, the way drivers spoke when they were trying not to sound ridiculous while describing something that felt wrong. The caller began with location fragments, a road name, a rough direction, a reference to a mile marker she might have read wrong. Her breathing was shallow, punctured by the faint whine of tires on wet pavement. The first words that mattered came fast. "I can see someone on the shoulder, and they are not moving." From the 911 transcript excerpt, the dispatcher's responses on the tape were fractionally too early, overlapping the caller's sentences as if the operator had anticipated her words. It was not simply fast talk. It was as though the dispatcher's voice had been pulled forward in time and laid down first, and the caller's voice had been forced to catch up. Marlene cross-checked the call with the cell carrier's records, expecting at least one clean anchor point. The carrier report showed the device initiated an emergency call in the correct window. It showed a brief period where the handset stopped updating location, then resumed. That freeze interval matched the same short span represented by the audio offset. Call drop coincided with a brief GPS freeze interval on the handset record. From the carrier log extract 4 seconds, it was always 4 seconds, not 1 minute, not a repeating minute, not a long gap a fatigued human might misremember. This was a breath of time, a slip small enough to hide inside routine until someone listened carefully. Responding units had found the car on the shoulder less than an hour after dispatch logged the drop. The hazard lights still blinked. The engine idled. The doors were closed. There was no sign of a struggle in the gravel or roadside grass. The shoulder was wet enough to keep clear tracks, yet the only footprints documented near the driver's side were those of the first deputy on scene. The phone was on the driver's seat, screen dark, as if it had locked in the middle of the call. It carried a smudged palm print across the glass, the kind of smear that happened when someone grabbed a device quickly. Technicians later compared that smear to the woman's known prints, taken from the steering wheel and the interior handles. They matched her in the expected places. The print on the phone did not. It was larger than her palm, with a wider span between finger pads. The proportions were subtly wrong, not in a dramatic way, but enough that the evidence tech noted it as inconsistent with the registered owner. Latent palm impression on device screen did not match owner's hand size proportions. From the evidence technician's note, investigators tried to stay practical. They considered a second person touching the phone. They considered contamination. They considered the possibility that the device had been handled at the scene before photographs were taken. The chain of custody log showed proper procedure. The responding deputy's body camera footage showed the moment the phone was recovered, untouched until gloved hands lifted it. Marlene listened to the tape again and focused on what the caller described. The woman reported a figure ahead, just inside the reach of her headlights. She said it was standing near the edge of the ditch where the shoulder dropped. She said it did not wave. It did not move away. It did not do anything that would suggest normal human behavior on a rural road at night. Then the call shifted. The dispatcher asked a standard question, but on the recording, the dispatcher's question began a fraction of a beat before the caller's last word. It was the same misalignment, the same sense of a system responding too early. The caller's breathing changed. Her voice tightened. She described the figure as closer than it should have been, as if the distance in her headlights had compressed without her car moving. On the tape, a soft sound entered beneath her words, faint but distinct. A low, wet scrape like something sliding across gravel, and then abruptly a second voice appeared. For a fraction of a second in the background of the caller's audio. It was too quiet to transcribe cleanly, but the technician flagged it as a vocalization not consistent with the caller or the dispatcher. It sounded like a breath taken too close to a microphone. I heard something under her voice that did not belong to either side of the call. From the technician's review annotation, the call dropped. Responders found no one. Search teams combed ditches and tree lines through the night. They checked culverts and creek beds. They found tire tracks consistent with the caller's approach and stop. They found no clear departure path from the shoulder. The woman was never located. Marlene wrote an internal memo that stayed within safe language. She did not claim time travel. She did not claim the call answered itself. She used words like offset, misalignment, unexplained lead time. She recommended additional clock checks and cross-system time verification, which the county installed. The system became more stable afterward, but the change did not answer the question that bothered the operators who listened to the tape in the break room, leaning close to the speaker and replaying those first seconds. How did a dispatcher's voice exist on the recording before the network acknowledged the call? There was no satisfying explanation that fit every piece. The clean pre-answer audio, the matching 4-second freeze on the handset location record, the empty vehicle, and a palm print that did not match the person who owned the phone. After the audit, night shift operators developed a quiet habit. When a line rang from certain corridors, they watched the screen, waited for the system to show connection, and only then spoke their greeting. Not because they believed the call could answer itself, because the tape suggested something worse, that in some places the conversation was already happening a few seconds ahead of them, and the system was simply trying to catch up. Archival transition. The recording carried a response before the plea had fully formed. The next file hinged on a different kind of mismatch, where a shape stayed still by the water until witnesses looked at it through its reflection. Tom Ward and Javier Salas fished the north shore of the reservoir for the same reason they chose night runs on empty roads and back trails over crowded parks. Fewer people meant fewer variables. The spot they liked sat past a locked service gate and a long walk along a gravel maintenance track. The bank there sloped gently, the water deep close to shore with a clean casting lane that rarely snagged. They arrived in the last hour of daylight on a calm evening in early autumn. The air held that damp, cool smell of algae and decomposing leaves. The surface of the reservoir lay almost perfectly still, reflecting the tree line in a crisp, inverted band, as if the lake had been polished. Tom set his tackle methodically, the way he did everything. He clipped a small headlamp to his cap, but kept it off to preserve night vision. Javier set up several yards away, far enough to keep lines from crossing, close enough that neither of them felt alone out there. They cast into the darkening water and settled into the quiet rhythm of waiting, listening, adjusting. The first sign that something had changed was not a sound. It was stillness behaving too cleanly. Across the reservoir, on the opposite bank, Tom noticed a shape near the waterline. It stood upright and narrow, darker than the trees behind it, but not sharply outlined, like a figure cut from the dusk itself. At first glance, it registered as another angler, someone standing and watching the water. What made Tom keep looking was the lack of small human movement. No shift of weight, no shoulder roll, no hand movement toward a pocket or a phone. Just a pose held too long to be comfortable. It did not move the way a person stands still. It looked placed. From Tom Ward's written statement, he did not call out. The distance was too far for a casual greeting, and the moment felt like a test he could fail by acknowledging it. He watched for any cue that could turn the shape into something ordinary, a rod lift, a step, a cigarette glow. Nothing. Tom's eyes dropped to the water in front of him. The reflection of the far shoreline lay clean on the surface, trees reaching downward in a perfect mirror. In that reflection, the standing shape did not match itself. Where the figure on the bank appeared tall and slim, the reflected counterpart looked thicker through the middle, edges smearing as if the reflection could not hold a consistent outline. The head shape in the water was not a head at all. It was a low, dark blot, like an absence where a face should have been. Witnesses reported a silhouette mismatch between shoreline subject and its reflected form. From the compiled witness summary, Tom shifted his stance, changing his angle, checking whether his eyes were playing tricks with distance and glare. The mismatch remained. The shoreline shape stayed rigid. The reflected shape wavered and bulged. Javier followed Tom's gaze without a word, his attention moving from the far bank to the glassy surface and back again, as if his brain refused to reconcile both images at once. The unspoken agreement formed quickly. Something about the reflection was more honest than the thing casting it. Then the water began to move. Not everywhere, not as a breeze line or a passing fish. The first ripple appeared directly beneath the reflected blot on the surface where the shoreline figure's mirror image should have been. A ring spread outward in a clean circle, then another, each one widening across the still reservoir like a quiet alarm. Tom and Javier felt the air remain unchanged. No gust touched their faces. The nearby reeds did not sway. The branch tips above them stayed motionless. Water movement began in concentric rings with wind speed recorded near zero. From the Ranger weather station log and attached conditions report, Tom reached for his phone with a slow, controlled motion and started recording. The camera's night mode struggled, but the video captured the rings spreading and the mirrored tree line shivering with each wave. It also captured something else. The ripple origin did not drift. It stayed fixed, as if pinned to a point in the water that did not care about current or surface tension. The shoreline figure still did not take a step. Yet in the reflection, the dark smear elongated, pulling away from the bank in a slow stretch, like ink being drawn across paper. The movement did not suggest legs. It suggested sliding. Tom's first instinct was to leave. His second instinct was to confirm, to anchor the event in something besides memory. He panned his phone slightly, framing the far bank and the water surface together, trying to keep both the real shape and the wrong version in the same shot. The reflected form appeared to extend while the shoreline form remained static. From Javier Salas's supplemental statement, they reeled in at nearly the same pace, not hurried, but efficient, hands moving with the discipline of people who had learned that panic creates mistakes. Hooks were secured. Gear was gathered. The walk back to the truck began with both men keeping their headlamps off, guided by the pale strip of gravel and the faint glow of the sky. Halfway back, Tom looked over his shoulder. On the far bank, the upright figure was no longer visible. The opposite shoreline looked empty, just trees and stone and a thin band of dark waterline, but the reservoir surface still carried the disturbance. The rings had widened and softened, yet a darker band lingered where the reflection had been, dissolving slowly into the uniform darkness, as if the water was reluctant to fully forget the shape that had touched it. It was gone from the shore, but the water still looked marked. From Tom Ward's follow-up voice memo, they left without calling for help from the bank. There was nothing to report that would fit neatly into a reasonable dispatch note. No threat, no crime, no injury. Just an inconsistency that felt like it belonged in an archive rather than a patrol log. The report reached rangers the next morning anyway, filed through the park office as a safety concern. 2 rangers and a resource specialist went to the North Shore first, then drove around to access the opposite bank by Service Road. Conditions were favorable for tracks. The shoreline soil held moisture well. Any person standing there would have left clear impressions near the waterline. Any animal would have left sign, scuffs, disturbed sand, dragged reeds. They found no standard footprints. Instead, running parallel to the water's edge, they found a thin, continuous groove scored into the damp sand. It was not a series of steps. It was a line, uniform in width, as if something with a smooth underside had slid along the shore without lifting. The sand along the groove was darker and wetter than the surrounding area, a fresh-looking smear that followed the bank like a seam. Single, continuous drag line observed along shoreline with no discrete foot impressions. From the site inspection summary, in several places the groove deepened slightly, as if weight had shifted or paused. Those deeper points did not resemble knees or hands. They resembled pressure applied without edges, the kind of indentation left by a heavy body settling briefly and then moving on. The resource specialist photographed the line, measured its width, and attempted to match it to known causes: boat hull drag, canoe keel marks, fallen log movement, animal belly slides. None fit cleanly. A boat drag should have shown approach tracks, heel marks, scuff patterns, evidence of human presence. An animal slide should have shown claw marks, paw prints, disturbed reeds. There was none of that. The team checked the immediate tree line for any sign of entry or exit. Broken branches, scraped bark, crushed grass. The area looked undisturbed, as if the shoreline had been visited by something that did not need to walk in or walk out. Surrounding vegetation showed no approach path consistent with human or common wildlife traffic. From the field evidence sheet, Tom returned once, weeks later, in daylight, standing at the same North Shore spot, with the sun high and the water bright. The far bank looked ordinary. The reservoir looked ordinary. He told himself the entire event might collapse into a misunderstanding if he could find the right angle, the right glare, the right trick of light. He could not. What stayed with him was not the figure itself, because it never did anything overtly violent. What stayed with him was the moment his eyes accepted that the reflection was not simply a mirror. It was a separate representation, and the 2 representations disagreed. It felt like being offered a choice between realities and realizing that neither option came with a guarantee. Seeing it in the reflection made it feel closer than distance should allow. From Tom Ward's recorded statement, after that, he avoided still water at dusk. He chose rivers that moved, ponds with wind, places where the surface never held an image long enough to betray itself. And when he did fish reservoirs again, he kept his phone fully charged, his camera ready, and his eyes trained on the one place people rarely look until it is too late: the surface. Final archival note: 9 files, 9 environments where something unknown used ordinary systems as a disguise. Radio channels, cameras, tracks, audio gaps, water surfaces, and the human habit of trusting what the eye expects. Across the set, the common thread was not aggression, it was calibration.